I acquired a property, and subsequently, my husband issued an outrageous request, leading me to impart a lesson he won't soon forget. Hey, where are you? Stop fooling around. Everything is missing from the house. What's happening? I've packed my belongings and departed. What? Why would you do this? Well, we're pursuing a dissolution of marriage, so it's logical for me to leave. Dissolution? What are you referring to? Indeed, I've already submitted the necessary documentation. My name is Amanda, I'm 35, and I'm employed in an office setting. I've been wedded to David for 5 years. Initially, matters were satisfactory, nothing exceptional, but tolerable. Gradually, fissures began to appear. 2 years prior, David resigned from his position to launch a business. I endorsed him wholeheartedly, having faith in his concept, but it never materialized. Instead, it depleted our financial reserves. I was burdened with covering all expenses, rent, food, utilities, while he faced difficulties. If financial matters were the sole concern, perhaps we could have resolved them. However, the true issue was his relatives. David's mother and sister remained in their familial residence, and each visit felt akin to entering hostile territory. They critiqued everything I did, made me feel like an intruder, and persistently disparaged me. It wasn't merely sporadic comments, it was a ceaseless barrage of criticism that eroded my spirit. Despite possessing our own dwelling merely 10 minutes away, David was adamant that we visit them frequently. Initially, I perceived it as a component of being a supportive spouse. But the more I visited, the more severe their verbal attacks became. When I began to assert myself, the circumstances intensified. And then there was the monetary aspect. Amanda, I require $500 for a companion's birthday present. Could you lend me the funds? $500? What are you acquiring? A luxury boat? You're so stingy, Amanda. Doesn't David provide for you? You can't even do this minor thing for your sister-in-law? I gazed at her bewildered. Provide for me? I was the one financing everything while David hadn't contributed a single cent in over a year. And as for his sister, why didn't she seek employment instead of depending on her mother? Before I could articulate a response, David interjected, Amanda, simply give her the $500. His mother radiated joy. David, you're such a considerate son. Then his sister, appearing as though she'd been deprived of her preferred confection, added, Can you provide me with $300 as well? I need to purchase something. David didn't even pause. Of course, Amanda possesses $300 in her purse. Just take it. As if my diligently acquired funds were his to allocate. And then, as if that wasn't sufficiently egregious, he stated, Thanks to me, we possess a place to reside. I simply stared at him, utterly flabbergasted. Later in the vehicle, I couldn't restrain myself. Why do you behave like some sort of benefactor when you don't even settle the invoices? He shrugged. I possess my dignity as the eldest son. That ignited another dispute. If you provide them with funds once, they'll persistently request more, I cautioned. But making my mother content isn't a negative thing, he countered. David, we can't sustain this. We're scarcely managing, and you haven't contributed a cent. We need to conserve. From that instant onward, all we engaged in was conflict. And then, one day, it dawned on me. Why was I even persisting? Why was I enduring all of this? The ultimate catalyst occurred when David said, Hey, let's proceed to my mother's residence. I didn't even glance up. Proceed alone. His countenance darkened. A spouse is supposed to accompany her husband. I cast him a sharp look. Oh, truly? Then why don't you ever accompany me when I visit my parents? He clicked his tongue in irritation and stormed off. Honestly, that weekend was the most serene I'd experienced in years. No domineering mother-in-law, no self-entitled sister-in-law, just tranquility, quietude, autonomy. For the first time in ages, I possessed the latitude to contemplate clearly. I dedicated the subsequent 2 days to concentrating on something that genuinely held significance, my aspiration of possessing my own dwelling. I investigated listings, procured brochures, and devoted hours to visualizing how I would embellish it. a space that was exclusively mine, devoid of censure, devoid of individuals who depleted me without gratitude. By the time David ultimately returned, it felt as though a burden had been alleviated. I was more buoyant, more resilient, and more resolute than ever. "Oh, you've returned," I greeted him serenely. He disregarded me, sulking like an adolescent. It was lamentable. Shouldn't a mature male comprehend how to conduct himself as an adult? I didn't engage. I simply turned and commenced preparing supper, silently strategizing my subsequent maneuver. I was finished. Anticipating. It was time to assume command of my existence. Then, unexpectedly, he uttered, "You've been excessively rebellious lately." I turned to him, taken aback. "Rebellious? Simply because I declined to visit your mother and sister?" "Yes," he affirmed, as though it were the most natural occurrence in the world. "A spouse should comply with her husband. If you cannot do that, perhaps we should obtain a dissolution of marriage." "Dissolution?" I blinked, momentarily disoriented. After all our disputes, I didn't anticipate him to utter that term so nonchalantly. He leaned back, crossing his arms, an irritating smirk adorning his countenance. "You don't desire my departure, do you?" He paused, evidently anticipating me to succumb to panic, perhaps even dissolve into tears. "Well, I'm exceedingly vexed with you. I've already executed my portion of the divorce documents. If you defy me again, I'll submit them. Contemplate meticulously." With that, he turned and departed, smugly adding, "I'm going to bathe. Expedite the preparation of supper." The instant the water commenced running, I couldn't suppress a smile. "Oh, David, you have no comprehension. You've just presented me with the key to my liberation." I entered the kitchen and initiated the preparation of supper, but this time there was a buoyancy in my spirit. A serene elation effervesced within me. For years I had treaded cautiously, endeavoring to maintain tranquility, anticipating David's transformation. But this was the escape I had been yearning for. From that day forward, I became intensely focused on conserving every possible dollar. Every surplus penny was directly deposited into my personal account, a silent countdown to the existence I had envisioned. I resided frugally, eschewing superfluous expenditures, concealing my exhilaration behind a composed, placid demeanor. David never discerned. He was too engrossed in his own perception of authority, persuaded that I would capitulate, that I would implore him to remain. I don't believe he ever envisioned that I might be orchestrating my exodus. Months elapsed, and my strategy unfolded flawlessly. I didn't merely desire to depart. I desired to depart with something that symbolized my self-sufficiency. Thus I acquired a house, a genuine dwelling entirely my own, free from his sway. The sole remaining step was relocating, and I would execute it on my own terms. I commenced packing, but not simultaneously. Gradually, meticulously, one container at a time. I dispatched my possessions to my parents' residence under the pretext of decluttering. They were cognizant of everything and had been my steadfast support throughout this undertaking. Each progression forward alleviated the encumbrance I had been bearing for so long. When the moment ultimately arrived, David was absent for the weekend, visiting his relatives. It was the ideal occasion. That weekend, I packed the remainder of my belongings, exited the apartment, and never looked back. That location hadn't been a home. It had been a confinement. Now I was liberated. My new dwelling was everything I had visualized. Luminous, invigorating, tranquil. The walls still exuded the aroma of fresh paint, and for the first time in years, I felt as though I could genuinely respire. I took my time unpacking, relishing every instant of making the space my own. This was my triumph. Every corner of the house epitomized a future devoid of apprehension or coercion. The quietude was solace, and an overwhelming sensation of alleviation washed over me. I no longer had to answer to him. I no longer had to brace myself for his temperamental shifts or contend with his domineering disposition. I was in command now. That evening, as I arranged the concluding embellishments around my dwelling, my phone vibrated. David's name illuminated the screen. A subtle smirk graced my lips. I comprehended precisely the reason for his call. "Hey, Where are you? His voice was incisive, imperious, as though he still possessed a prerogative to a response. Where do you surmise? I retorted, my tone deliberately ambiguous, allowing him to dwell in the enigma for a moment. Don't engage in games with me. The apartment is vacant. What the hell is transpiring? I emitted a soft chuckle. I packed my belongings and departed. What? Why? I don't comprehend. His voice faltered, trepidation seeping in. I smiled to myself. Well, we're already divorced, so naturally I relocated. A considerable silence ensued. When he ultimately spoke, his voice quivered with incredulity. Divorced? Yes, I corroborated, a serene pride in my tone. I submitted the documents earlier today. As of now, we're complete strangers. Number, I don't accept this. His words emerged in a stifled vehemence. Exhilaration surged through me. But you were the one who proposed we could obtain a dissolution of marriage at any juncture. You articulated it yourself. And as a businessman, shouldn't you assume accountability for your pronouncements? I didn't await his rejoinder. The discourse was concluded. With that, everything was concluded. I terminated the call, my heart palpitating, not from apprehension, but from unadulterated alleviation. It was accomplished. The concluding chapter had been inscribed, and I had inscribed it myself. That night, I slumbered more soundly than I had in years. I hadn't apprehended the magnitude of the burden I had been bearing until it was dissipated. Awakening in my own dwelling, for the first time in a protracted period, I felt emancipated. Reclining in my own bed felt like the recompense I had long merited. No further stress, no further altercations, no further pretense that everything was satisfactory when it wasn't. No further interaction with his relatives, who treated me like a financial institution. It was merely me, ultimately and unequivocally liberated. The subsequent morning felt surreal. I had invited my parents over for the inaugural occasion since relocating, eager to share this fresh commencement with them. I devoted the morning to culinary pursuits, humming to myself as the delectable scents permeated the kitchen. It was a modest, intimate manner of commemorating a moment I knew I would treasure indefinitely. When my parents arrived, my mother gasped, surveying the space. "This is extraordinary," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with veneration. My father smiled, his countenance brimming with pride. "You accomplished well, child." We toasted to nascent beginnings, glasses of effervescent cider clinking together. It wasn't merely a commemoration of my dwelling. It was a commemoration of everything I had striven for, my self-reliance, my serenity. Laughter permeated the room, a warmth I hadn't experienced in years. We conversed about everything and nothing, simply savoring the moment, cognizant that I was ultimately where I was destined to be. Then the doorbell resonated. I frowned, perplexed. Who could that be? Curiosity impelled me to the intercom, and when I scrutinized the screen, my stomach churned. Standing outside were David, his mother, and his sister. "What are you doing here?" I inquired, incredulity lacing my words. David smirked, as though he possessed the premises, standing there with his customary arrogance, as though he possessed every prerogative to be present. His self-assurance was audacious, considering the circumstances. "We're relocating," he stated, as nonchalantly as if he were requesting a glass of water. I blinked, endeavoring to process what I had just heard. "Pardon me?" I inquired, unable to conceal the disbelief in my voice. His mother naturally interjected, bearing the same smug countenance she invariably displayed. "Your dwelling is sufficiently capacious for all of us," she declared matter-of-factly, as though this were the most logical proposition in the world. "And my husband is hospitalized. Upon his discharge, he'll be residing here as well. Now, unlock the entrance." It was evident she didn't even fathom the ludicrousness of her entreaty. To her, my dwelling, my universe, was simply theirs for the taking. I gazed at them, endeavoring to fathom the sheer audacity of the situation. Then, almost laughing in astonishment, I ultimately located my voice. Are you out of your senses? Why would I permit you entry? Vacate my property immediately. Her eyes widened in indignation, as though I had just reviled her. How dare you? You're being exceedingly impolite. What's yours is ours. Unlock this entrance forthwith. Her sense of entitlement resounded through her voice, the same manipulative intonation she had likely employed her entire life. The sole distinction this time was that someone was confronting her. I inhaled deeply, stabilizing myself. I had striven too arduously for my emancipation to permit them to trample over it anew. I have no comprehension of what you're alluding to. In case you've forgotten, I'm single now, I stated, maintaining my voice resolute, rendering it unequivocal just how preposterous this entire situation was. Her countenance contorted in bewilderment. She appeared genuinely perplexed, as though she couldn't fathom what I was articulating. What do you intend? She demanded, her tone escalating in aggressiveness. I raised an eyebrow, my forbearance waning. Didn't your son inform you? We're divorced. We're complete strangers now. Articulating those words felt empowering. I wasn't retreating this time. A tense silence permeated the air. David's mother and sister turned to him, their gazes demanding an elucidation. He stammered, groping for words, but it was inconsequential. I had already resolved. None of you are welcome here. I stated firmly, severing the tension. Please depart. I didn't await a rejoinder. I depressed the button, silencing the intercom. The discourse was terminated. David reacted instantaneously, pounding on the entrance, his fist impacting the wood in exasperation. Unlock, we need to converse. His panic was palpable, but I remained steadfast. The authority was in my grasp now. Then something outside captured my attention, flashing crimson and azure lights reflecting off my window. My heart skipped a beat. I peered outside and observed a police vehicle drawing up in front of my dwelling. For the first time in years, I experienced a surge of relief. I retreated as officers approached, their presence dissipating the pandemonium David and his relatives were generating. Within moments, they had him restrained, handcuffed, and prepared for removal. I observed, feeling the tension dissipate from my physique. This was it, the moment I had been anticipating. Finally, tranquility, finally emancipation. David's voice pierced the nocturnal stillness. Why are you perpetrating this upon me? He vociferated, his tone desperate yet vacuous, like a supplication no one cared to acknowledge. His mother and sister stood immobilized, their astonishment palpable. The officers didn't apprehend them, but they firmly directed them away, rendering it unequivocal that they were no longer welcome. I stepped outside, still processing everything that had just transpired. Then, I discerned my father standing to the side, composed as always, arms folded, observing with quiet assurance. He extended a peace gesture to me, grinning as though this were merely another mundane occurrence. In situations akin to this, invariably summon law enforcement Arasoro. He stated nonchalantly, as though he were imparting to me the fundamentals of self-preservation. I laughed, a fusion of alleviation and gratitude swelling within my chest. I cherish you, Father, I stated earnestly. We re-entered the dwelling, resuming our commemoration with a reinvigorated vigor. The tension had dissipated, superseded by the clinking of glasses and genuine mirth. It felt like an authentic fresh commencement, like I could ultimately respire. Later that evening, I ascertained the full magnitude of David's actions. He had been stalking me, trailing me from my place of employment, lingering until I arrived home, strategizing when to execute his maneuver. When he confessed it to law enforcement, they didn't treat it lightly. They rendered it unequivocal that if he ever reappeared, they would apprehend him forthwith. But I wasn't apprehensive. I comprehended David excessively well. He was a craven individual, and subsequent to today, he wouldn't dare jeopardize another confrontation. Merely to ensure safety, I petitioned for a restraining order, not solely against him, but his entire family. It was time to sever all affiliations permanently. As for David, His existence swiftly disintegrated, subsequent to the dissolution of marriage. His enterprise, which had relied substantially on my monetary assistance, commenced to founder. Without my funds to sustain them, his relatives grappled to settle their expenses. With his father remaining hospitalized, their circumstances slowly deteriorated. Ultimately, they were compelled to vend their dwelling. Karma had ultimately overtaken them, and I couldn't disavow a modicum of gratification. For me, existence is superior to ever. Inviting my parents to cohabitate was an effortless decision, one I never second-guessed. Possessing them here imbued my dwelling with the warmth I hadn't apprehended I was deficient in. They never ceased reminding me of their pride, of how fortunate they felt to have me as their progeny. That kind of affection and validation rendered every tribulation worthwhile. Now, we're content, gratified, and at peace. The dwelling feels transformed, animate with mirth, shared repasts, and the diminutive moments that render each day exceptional. I rediscovered my path to where I genuinely belong, where affection and sustenance transform this house into an actual home. I comprehend that challenges will arise as my parents advance in age, but I'm prepared for them. I aspire to be present for them, just as they were for me, proffering not solely care, but the identical emotional sustenance they've perpetually bestowed. Whether it's orchestrating their appointments, ensuring they possess everything they necessitate, or simply being present with them when they experience despondency, I'll be their steadfast presence. I'll heed their narratives with forbearance and allocate them the time and consideration they merit. And when existence becomes arduous, I'll be the one to elevate them, just as they did for me. This is my opportunity to demonstrate to them the magnitude of their significance to me, the depth of my gratitude for everything they've accomplished. Every moment is of significance: the anecdotes, the hilarity, the serene afternoons together. Time progresses rapidly, but I'm resolute in treasuring every second. For the first time in a protracted period, I feel genuinely at home, and nothing, no one, will ever deprive me of that. Thank you for observing. If you savored the narrative, don't neglect to express your appreciation for the video and subscribe to our channel. We anticipate your presence next time.